Topic Notes 4.1 Populations. This is a large school of barracuda I took a picture of off of the Galapagos Islands. And of course, they are all there because there's abundant resources to support their population. And that is one of the key features of the notes coming up next. So the main idea in this note set is that populations interact with each other in a variety of ways, and through that interaction, communities change over time. So there are two conditions that essentially outline the interactions within a community. First, all organisms within an ecosystem affect each other. Essentially, nobody lives in isolation. And then the second is that resources in any ecosystem exist in a limited supply. This sets up drama, right? Because there's going to be a competition for these resources. Now, we can track population growth and change using a couple of specific parameters and factors. First of all, birth rate and death rate, right? Adding to and subtracting from the population. You also have migration, and there are various different types. There's gains, which are immigration with an I, where you have animals coming into or organisms coming into a population, adding to it, or losses, immigration E, they're going away. Now here is the general equation, R equals birth minus death plus I immigration minus E immigration. These factors are affected by the availability of resources in any ecosystem. This can affect whether animals, for example, migrate away or migrate to an area, or die because they don't have enough resources, or continue to give birth at a rapid rate because they have plenty of resources. Now, as we look at how growth rate actually plays out, there's a couple of different models. First, we can look at exponential growth. This is rapid, unchecked population growth. It occurs when resources are abundant and competition is low, essentially meaning it's a free-for-all, there's no limiting factors, everybody's just having a party, reproducing, getting plenty of food, everything's wonderful. This results in what we call a J-curve, and you can see that J-curve in this graph. Essentially, the population starts off low, but then it starts to get larger very, very quickly. Now, this happens to be an example from bacteria, which do this quite readily. If you put them in an agar plate full of food, essentially, and let them go to town, they will just explode in population very quickly. Now, of course, all parties come to an end, and exponential growth can often come to a very sudden end because all of a sudden the resources run out, predators explode, whatever the case may be. It's often referred to as a boom and bust sort of pattern over time. Now, another way to look at this is logistic growth, which is actually more realistic. Population growth rate decreases as it approaches the maximum size imposed by limited resources. We call this environmental resistance. This can come in the form of reduced food resources, maybe not enough space, and so things get constricted. Maybe population of predators starts to rise, and so that starts to take that the prey population down, things like that. It results in what we call an S curve on the population graph, where you've got that beginning of the exponential growth, and you can see that on the bottom graphs there with the paramecium and the daphnia, which are potentially a type of microorganism. They have that J-curve for exponential growth, but then all of a sudden it starts to curve down and then sort of level out. And you'll see on the larger chart on the top how it sort of wiggles up and down a little bit. That's because that resistance and the actual amount of organisms that can be sustained in a habitat, in an ecosystem, sort of fluctuates as well. And this brings us to a great vocabulary term called carrying capacity. This is the largest population size that can be sustained by the available resources. And that yellow line that goes across that top graph, it's labeled carrying capacity. That is essentially what we're talking about. Now, you'll notice the actual population line sort of fluctuates above and below the carrying capacity, and that's a normal fluctuation that occurs. So let's give a real-world example here. We're going to look at harbor seals in Washington State. Now, in the early 20th century, hunting decimated their numbers. They were essentially thought as a harmful predator for the fish that the fishermen like to catch, things like that. And so they were essentially protected. And due to that protection, their numbers have rebounded in roughly a logistical pattern. And you can see how that works from around just around 1975. You can see that J curve started to really happen. Like they really took off, exploded, if you will. And by the 1990s, you'll notice that things sort of leveled off and there seemed to be a carrying capacity that sort of hit right around 7,500 in terms of the total number of seals in that area. Now, one of the forms of environmental resistance is competition. Competition occurs when both species are negatively affected by trying to fill the same ecological niche, typically with some sort of limited resources, things like that. So there are two different kind of categories of competition we can look at. There's intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. Now, intraspecific competition is competition between individuals of the same species. Now, this competition can be for mates, for shelter, for food, light, nutrients, that kind of a thing. Interspecific competition is competition between members of different species for space and food. Now, the way I kind of think of it in terms of making them make sense is the intranet is usually a network that's within a company or, like I said, within our school system, right? So intraspecific is within, for example, all of the elephant seals. That's the picture on the top right there of elephant seals, right? Now, interspecific, think of internet, which is pretty much global, right? Everybody's on it. So interspecific would be like competition for space between all of the different intertidal species that are kind of vying for space. And that's that bottom picture. You have mussels, you have barnacles, you have snails, things like that. They're all competing for space in there. That's interspecific competition. Now, in nature, generally, most populations try to reduce competition. Now, by reducing competition, you have a better likelihood of reproducing and doing your thing. So one way in which we do this is called resource partitioning. And this is what occurs when species avoid competition for a particular resource by specializing in just part of the resource. A great example here would be water birds, right? You have different birds that have different adaptations to reach different food sources along the seashore. Flamingo, for example, has that long neck, so it can get at some of the same organisms, the same little shrimps and clams and things in the sediments, but it can go in deeper water, whereas the plovers and the oyster catchers are really stuck getting those items closer to the land, right along the edge of the water. So that kind of separates out where these birds access their food. Now let's look at a real-world example off the coast of Hawaii. This is a study tracking the distribution of 4 shark species: the sandbar shark, the Galapagos shark, the tiger shark, and the gray reef shark. And this study ranges from the main Hawaiian islands, and you can see this in the spectrum of pie charts in the middle of the slide here. On the left side, you'll see the main islands: Hawaii, Maui, Oahu, and Kauai. And then it continues to go on to the northwestern islands, which you may or may not be as familiar with. Now, if you notice the way the pie charts are shaded, the gray area is going to be the sandbar sharks, and the black areas of the pie charts are going to be the gray reef sharks. Now, you can notice right away that the gray area predominates in areas towards the main Hawaiian islands: Hawaii, Maui, Oahu, and Kauai. And right in the middle where you see Niuhu, that sort of is the middle ground there, where you also see a decent number of gray reef sharks. But northwest of that, Nectar and Mara Reef and Midway Island, those only have the gray reef shark. So essentially, these two shark species have kind of partitioned themselves. Why did they do this? The gray reef shark and the sand tiger shark have the highest degree of dietary overlap of all the 4 shark species. They primarily eat fish and squid. So essentially, they almost never occur together except for the middle ground of these two territories between the main Hawaiian Islands and the Northwestern Islands. Now, predator-prey relationships are very important. Predator population size and spatial distribution is often linked to prey. Predator-prey relationships are crucial for keeping a healthy balance of populations within an ecosystem. Here's an example. Sea stars and mussels. Sea stars eat the mussels, so there's only going to be enough mussels to provide a certain amount of food for a certain amount of sea stars. Not to mention they're spatially distributed in ways in which to either avoid predation or gain access to their food. So this brings us to the concept of keystone species, which is an organism that plays a unique and crucial role in a way an ecosystem functions. Without keystone species, the ecosystem would be dramatically different or cease to exist altogether. Now, keystone species will often control other species by means of grazing, predation, and competition. They may also be capable of ecosystem engineering, essentially creating a habitat, if you will. Removal of a keystone species usually causes dramatic changes to a community and an ecosystem. And a great example of this would be the sea otters and urchins in the Pacific Northwest. So sea urchins eat algae, specifically the kelp. Now, the kelp are these long strands of algae that go from the seafloor all the way to the surface of the water. And they provide a forest, if you will, underwater. And tons of species rely on these kelp forests. Now, the sea otters prey on the sea urchins. This is important because without the sea otters, the sea urchin population would get so large, it would literally decimate the kelp forest. And that's the picture on the right. With sea otters, you have a healthy kelp forest with, yes, some urchins, but not an overwhelming amount of them. Now, we found out about this particular problem when we started hunting sea otters for their pelts. This, of course, happened a long time ago, but we nearly wiped the sea otters out. And that nearly wiped the kelp forests out. But now, due to the protection of sea otters, the kelp forests are coming back and everything is sort of balancing out again. Disease can be another big factor for populations. Disease is an illness characterized by specific signs and symptoms. They can be caused by pathogens such as viruses and bacteria. They result in a decrease of distribution and abundance of whatever particular species or population you're talking about. Now, an example of this would be coral disease called the stony coral tissue loss disease. It was first found in Florida in around 2014. By 2019, it had spread to half the stony coral species found in the Florida reef tract. Now you can see the map that shows you just how far ranging this particular disease is, and also what the impact is to the coral. This shows you one coral monitored between January of 2017 to February of 2017, and the amount of dead coral, 60% of it is now dead in that particular study. So disease can have a big impact on various different habitats and populations and species. Now, to understand how populations change over time, we have to look at evolution and natural selection. Natural selection favors individuals that survive longer, grow faster, and produce more offspring. So predators, for example, that are more efficient at accessing prey, they are going to pass on their traits. So essentially, natural selection is going to favor them. Prey, on the other hand, that are more successful at surviving predation, that's where natural selection is going to favor that particular category. So these are the things that occur. And of course, this was all initially brought up by Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species, the big book he put out. He studied a lot of different forms of evidence, but one of the things he looked at were finches on the Galapagos Island that had different beaks, and thus they accessed different types of resources and food. What this all boils down to, however, is that predator and prey often evolve together. We talk about coevolution is the interplay with each species evolving in response to the other. Okay, one species gets faster so they can catch their prey. The prey become more maneuverable so they can outmaneuver the predator, and so on and so forth. So there's a constant coevolution between animals. Sometimes they're symbiotic relationships, like you have the clownfish and the anemone who have essentially worked together to avoid predation or to access resources, one of those types of things. All right, that is it for this note set. So make sure you pay attention to that main idea. Populations interact with each other in a variety of ways, and through that interaction, communities change over time. And of course, all of the individual learning goals that go along with this. Until next time, keep learning.